All eyes will now be on Kyaran Palace to see if Ankara can mediate a breakthrough. A third round of talks between Russia and Ukraine is set to be held in Istanbul on Wednesday. Now this as Russia has been escalating its attacks on Ukraine.
What happens when the one country that claims to stabilize the conflict is also the one profiting from keeping it unstable? Turkey's position in the Russia-Ukraine war represents one of the most precarious and potentially destabilizing balancing acts in modern geopolitics. At first glance, Ankara plays the role of the neutral mediator, the bridge between enemies, the host of fragile peace talks, the power that claims to steady the storm. But that image hides a far more dangerous truth. Turkey's dual loyalties and strategic ambiguities are complicating the war. Yes, selling drones to Ukraine while deepening energy ties with Russia, condemning the invasion yet refusing to enforce sanctions, hosting NATO radars while cutting new deals with Moscow. It's a calculated survival, and survival at Turkey's scale comes at a cost, because every step it takes between East and West threatens to crack NATO's unity, destabilize Europe's security, and weaken the sanctions wall meant to isolate the Kremlin. So how long can it keep playing both sides before the entire balance collapses? If you're enjoying this deep dive, please like the video and consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring more global insights. Now, back to the video. On the surface, Turkey presents itself as the peacemaker, the bridge holding the Russia-Ukraine war from total collapse. It hosted multiple rounds of negotiations in Istanbul, brokered prisoner swaps, and even helped secure the fragile Black Sea grain deal that kept global food supplies moving. If you only watch the headlines, you'd think Turkey was the responsible mediator keeping the war from spiraling out of control. But Turkey isn't playing peacekeeper. It's playing both sides. Yes, it is a NATO member, arming Ukraine with its now famous Bayraktar TB2 drones that terrorized Russian armor in the early months of the war. Yet at the very same time, Turkey keeps its economic lifeline with Moscow wide open. Nearly half of its natural gas, over $8 billion worth every year, still flows from Russia, paid through channels that Ankara has repeatedly shielded from Western sanctions. This is clearly exploitation. By refusing to join the sanctions regime, Turkey has carved out a rare position, indispensable to both sides. To the West, it plays the loyal ally, upholding NATO's military architecture and offering weapons to Ukraine. To Russia, it plays the economic partner, keeping energy revenues and trade alive when the rest of Europe tries to choke them off. And in this double game, Turkey extracts enormous leverage. Every time NATO needs unity, Ankara reminds them it holds the keys to the Black Sea. Every time Moscow needs relief, Turkey positions itself as the last friendly gateway to the global economy. What looks like diplomacy is, in reality, survival at scale, and survival built on contradictions that could collapse the entire balance at any moment. One of the most alarming aspects of Turkey's role in the Russia-Ukraine war lies in its potential manipulation of NATO's collective defense framework, particularly Article 5, the cornerstone of the alliance, which states that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all. Turkey is not just any NATO member. It fields the alliance's second largest military after the United States, with around 350,000 active personnel and significant regional capabilities in land, air, and naval power. On paper, this makes Turkey a critical pillar of NATO's deterrence. In practice, however, Turkey has often shown a willingness to act unilaterally, sometimes in ways that create friction with its allies. So could Turkey's independent actions drag NATO into a conflict it never intended to fight? For example, Ankara has hinted at the possibility of deploying Turkish troops to Ukraine under the banner of a so-called peacekeeping mission, but such a deployment would be outside NATO's formal command structure. If Turkish soldiers in Ukraine were then attacked by Russian forces, the situation would become dangerously ambiguous. Would NATO be obligated to respond under Article 5, even though the mission was not officially sanctioned by the alliance? This is the gray zone where Turkey's strategic opportunism becomes risky. NATO would be forced into a difficult decision: either rally to Turkey's defense and risk direct escalation with Russia, or refuse, undermining the credibility of Article 5, the very clause that holds the alliance together. Either path could fracture NATO unity. There is also precedent for Ankara testing these boundaries. During conflicts in Syria, Turkey previously floated the idea of invoking Article 5 after cross-border incidents with Syrian and Russian forces. At the time, NATO allies pushed back, arguing that Turkey's operations in Syria were not alliance missions and therefore did not automatically qualify for collective defense. But the war in Ukraine is a much more sensitive stage. If Turkey were to act alone in Ukraine, the political pressure on NATO to respond to any escalation would be far greater than in the Syrian case. So, Turkey's dual posture, acting as both mediator and potential combatant, creates a situation where Article 5 could be stretched to its breaking point. One of Turkey's most underestimated sources of power lies not in tanks, drones, or fighter jets, but in geography. By controlling the Turkish straits, the Bosporus, and Dardanelles, Ankara holds the only maritime gateway between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. This authority is codified in the Montreux Convention of 1936, which gives Turkey the legal right to regulate naval passage through these narrow waterways. This makes Turkey the gatekeeper of the Black Sea, and in the context of the Ukraine war, that role carries enormous consequences. When Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Turkey quickly invoked the Montreux Convention to restrict the movement of warships belonging to the belligerents. Actually, this was a move that constrained Russia's ability to reinforce its Black Sea fleet. But in reality, Turkey has shown selective enforcement, allowing certain exceptions when it suits its interests, and signaling to Moscow that its neutrality has limits. This creates a dangerous ambiguity. Russia knows Turkey can tighten the straits at any moment, while NATO understands that Turkey could just as easily relax its grip if it sees an opportunity for leverage. That uncertainty itself becomes a form of power. The straits are not just a military choke point, they're also one of the most vital arteries of the global economy. Every single day, more than 3 million barrels of oil flow through these narrow waters, along with massive shipments of grain, steel, and other commodities. For countries in Europe and beyond, the Turkish straits are as essential as the Suez Canal or the Strait of Hormuz. This gives Ankara leverage on multiple fronts: over Russia, which depends on the straits for its energy exports; over Ukraine, which relies on them to keep its grain flowing to world markets; over NATO and the EU, which fear that any disruption could spike global prices and trigger political crises at home. Turkey has already demonstrated this leverage in practice. It played a pivotal role in brokering the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which allowed Ukraine to export food despite the war. But every extension of the deal became an opportunity for Ankara to extract concessions from both Moscow and the West. By opening or closing these maritime gates, Turkey can directly shape the tempo of the war, influence global markets, and remind its allies and adversaries alike that nothing in the Black Sea moves without its blessing. And next, the most overlooked yet critical aspects of Turkey's role in the Ukraine war lies in its economic relationship with Russia. While much of the West has sought to isolate Moscow through sweeping sanctions packages, Turkey has chosen a different path, balancing its formal NATO commitments with a series of quiet but highly consequential economic accommodations. Turkey continues to import vast quantities of Russian energy, particularly natural gas and oil. These imports not only provide a crucial lifeline for Moscow's revenues, but also reinforce Turkey's own energy security at a time when Europe has been scrambling to diversify away from Russian supplies. Here, Ankara has positioned itself as a middleman, deepening its reliance on Russian fuel while presenting itself to Europe as a transit hub for energy distribution. Beyond the energy sector, Turkey has effectively become a loophole in the Western sanctions regime. Reports indicate that Russian companies have used Turkish ports to re-export goods, including looted Ukrainian grain, back into global markets. These shipments undermine Western attempts to restrict Russia's ability to profit from the war, while simultaneously allowing Turkey to benefit from increased trade volumes. Perhaps even more problematic is Turkey's approach to financial transactions. Rather than directly violating sanctions, Ankara has facilitated complex workarounds. For example, Russian energy payments have been rerouted through third-party financial systems, including Austrian banks, to bypass restrictions on sanctioned Russian institutions. These methods remain technically legal, but they undercut the intended pressure of Western sanctions and highlight Turkey's willingness to prioritize its bilateral economic interests with Moscow over alliance cohesion. Also, Turkey has resisted efforts by the European Union to introduce more rigorous monitoring of Russian imports. Ankara's refusal to participate in mechanisms for tracking Russian gas and oil inflows reflects a broader strategic choice. While Europe seeks to cut dependence, Turkey sees advantage in maintaining its role as Russia's indispensable economic partner. And the result is a dual effect. On one hand, Turkey reinforces its value to Russia by offering access to global markets and alternative financial channels. On the other hand, it weakens the West's ability to present a united economic front, turning the sanctions regime into a patchwork that Moscow can exploit. Turkey's role in the Ukraine war can't be separated from its larger geopolitical project, one that stretches far beyond Kiev, Moscow, or even NATO. At the heart of President Tayyip Erdogan's foreign policy is what many analysts call neo-Ottomanism. It's not about rebuilding the Ottoman Empire brick by brick, but it is about reclaiming influence in the very regions that the empire once dominated: the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Balkans, and the Black Sea. For Erdogan, the Ukraine war is an opportunity. Russia's distraction and weakening create a vacuum, and Turkey has been quick to position itself as a power that can fill that space. In Syria, Turkey has long been entangled in the conflict, supporting opposition groups and carrying out military operations against both Kurdish forces and ISIS remnants. With Russia bogged down in Ukraine, Ankara sees more room to maneuver in northern Syria, pressing its territorial and security interests without fear of major Russian pushback. And then in Libya, Turkey intervened heavily in Libya's civil war, backing the Tripoli-based government of national accord with drones, military advisors, and naval support. This intervention wasn't just about helping an ally. It was about securing access to energy routes in the Mediterranean and carving out a sphere of influence where European powers like France had previously held sway. Also in the South Caucasus, during the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh War, Turkey openly supported Azerbaijan against Armenia, supplying Bayraktar drones that shifted the battlefield balance. This not only boosted Ankara's reputation as a reliable military partner, but also gave it greater say in shaping the future of the Caucasus, a region traditionally dominated by Russia. So why does this matter in the Ukraine war? The Ukraine war gives Turkey a perfect excuse to project power on multiple fronts. By balancing between Russia and NATO, Ankara gains leverage to push forward its regional ambitions. In the Black Sea, Turkey positions itself as the indispensable broker, the one country that can talk to both Kyiv and Moscow. In the Eastern Mediterranean, Ankara continues to press maritime claims through controversial agreements with Libya, challenging Greece and Cyprus directly. In the Middle East, Turkey frames itself as a stabilizing force even as it plays sides against one another to increase its own influence. And this is where tensions flare. For countries like Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, Turkey's moves are threatening. Greece sees Turkey's naval buildup and maritime boundary claims as a direct challenge to its sovereignty. Cyprus fears Turkish encroachment on its natural gas fields. Israel worries about Ankara trying to dominate Eastern Mediterranean energy routes and align itself with groups hostile to Israeli interests. Turkey isn't just playing mediator in Ukraine out of goodwill. It's using the war as a stepping stone toward regional hegemony. Every deal brokered, every drone sold, every grain shipment negotiated reinforces Ankara's role as a gatekeeper of stability and instability across multiple regions. Several analysts have begun warning that Turkey may be the new Iran. So this is not just a catchy phrase. It reflects a growing fear that Turkey is drifting into the same disruptive role Tehran plays, but with the added weight of NATO membership behind it. Like Iran, Turkey increasingly positions itself as a spoiler power, not fully aligned with the West, not fully aligned with the East, but constantly exploiting conflicts to carve out leverage. Ankara maintains tactical cooperation with adversaries like Russia, while openly defying the very allies it is treaty-bound to support. This duality is far more dangerous than Iran's behavior. Unlike Tehran, Turkey sits at the heart of NATO, giving it access to sensitive intelligence, advanced weapon systems, and the security umbrella of Article 5. Iran may destabilize the Middle East, but Turkey has the potential to destabilize NATO itself. The Ukraine war is the clearest example of this contradiction. If Turkey continues on this path, it risks becoming a systemic wildcard, not just undermining sanctions or shaping battlefields, but challenging the credibility of NATO's unity. One of the clearest flashpoints came with Ankara's purchase of the Russian-made S-400 air defense system, a move that directly undermined the security architecture of the alliance. The US responded by ejecting Turkey from the F-35 stealth fighter program, a major setback that symbolized how far trust had eroded between Washington and Ankara. But this wasn't an isolated incident. Turkey's repeated military operations against Kurdish forces in Syria, the very groups armed and trained by the US to fight ISIS, have fueled bitter tensions with Washington. To Ankara, these Kurdish groups are inseparable from the PKK insurgency at home. To the US, they were frontline partners in defeating terrorism. That contradiction has turned Syria into a long-running wedge issue between the two allies. Turkey has also demonstrated its readiness to hold NATO itself hostage when convenient. By delaying and blocking the accession of Sweden and Finland, Ankara showed that it could weaponize alliance decisions for its own bargaining power. The friction goes beyond defense policy. Turkey has steadily opened the door to closer ties with authoritarian regimes, while its economic dependence on China and Russia deepens each year. Energy imports from Moscow and trade partnerships with Beijing give Ankara alternative lifelines that weaken Western leverage. This strategic balancing act raises troubling questions. Is Turkey still committed to NATO's core values of collective defense and democratic cooperation? Or is it drifting toward an opportunistic path where membership is merely a tool for transactional advantage? The more Ankara diversifies away from the West, the less predictable and more destabilizing its role within NATO becomes. So Turkey's role in the Ukraine war represents a deeper structural challenge to the Western alliance system. By simultaneously maintaining extensive economic and security ties with Russia while exploiting NATO membership for protection and influence, Ankara is playing a dangerous double game that risks destabilizing Europe's fragile security architecture. And the immediate dangers are clear. NATO could be dragged into unintended crises through Turkish unilateral deployments. The Western sanctions regime against Moscow is being eroded by Turkish loopholes and economic channels. Rising frictions with Greece, Israel, and Cyprus heighten the risk of regional escalation at the Mediterranean's most volatile flashpoints. But beyond these short-term risks lies the broader strategic reality. Turkey has become the model for how middle powers can manipulate great power competition for their own benefit, bending alliances to serve national ambitions while rejecting shared values. If you found this analysis valuable, please consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into geopolitics. We would love to hear your thoughts. Drop your comments below and let us know what you think. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.